Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is the Washington, D.C. edition of American Government 110. So as you know, we didn't have class on Wednesday. Hope that wasn't a confusion for anybody. And just to double check with everyone, just so you know, we only hold class Mondays and Wednesdays in this class. Fridays, you get this specially constructed and delivered video sent right to your own email address box. So today, as you notice, there's a little box to, let's see, to this direction for you, to your left. I guess it's my left as well. So yeah, you'll be able to see me and see the slides instead of me holding up a sheet of paper and showing it to you like in previous videos. So we're getting even more advanced in our technology use. So we're going to finish up a couple points about Congress and then turn to a discussion of the presidency. So the next 20 minutes, gear up for an in-depth discussion of the American presidency and how it's changed. But first, so I wanted to point out one thing about Congress. The slide is saying divided government. Divided government means a different party controls the Congress from the party that controls the president. So right now, we don't have divided government. We have unified government because the Republicans control both chambers of Congress. They control the House and the Senate. And the Republicans also control the presidency. So that's unified government. But prior to this most recent election, there was a Democratic president, President Obama, and then we had a Republican-controlled Senate and House of Representatives. So that's divided government. Divided government doesn't always mean gridlock, that nothing gets done, but lately, most recent years, the past 15, 20 years, that's typically what's been the result of divided government, because both parties, they're not getting along very well nowadays. So divided government, that's when one party controls the House and another party controls the Congress, or one chamber of Congress. Okay, so that's one point I wanted to make about that. All right, so we're talking about Congress, and we're talking about how Congress makes decisions. What sort of factors does Congress kind of keep in mind when it's making decisions? Well, the short answer to that is there's multiple influences. So we have, for instance, institutional influences. Different kinds of norms. Norms are expectations on behavior. So when you're walking in front of someone and you go through a door and you open the door, well, it's often a norm that you hold the door open for the person behind you. Or another norm that we often observe is when you meet someone for the first time, you shake their hand. You say, hey, I'm so-and-so. I'm going to shake your hand now. So shaking someone's hand, that's a norm. It's kind of an expectation on behavior. Well, there's also expectations on behavior for people that serve in politics. And these expectations on behavior, these institutions and norms, can shape how Congress does what it does. So one norm is the norm of courtesy. Congressmen and congresswomen are supposed to address each other in a certain way, in a way that's respectful. So courtesy and respect helps the Congress function properly. There's also this norm of reciprocity. Reciprocity is saying, if you do something for me, I'll do something for you. We'll help each other out. Vote trading. The way that this comes up in Congress is often by trading votes. You vote for my bill, I'll vote for yours. So vote trading can be another important thing for how Congress does what it does. And then deference. Deference means deferring or allowing other people with more expertise or more seniority to kind of have the first say in something, or have the first move or the first, the first debate. They get the first word in a debate. So you defer to people with more expertise and more seniority. These kind of things, help explain what Congress does, what it does. So another word for reciprocity, and this is one I want you to remember, is log rolling. So this is exchanging political favors, such as votes, to achieve mutually beneficial legislative outcomes. Log rolling. You vote for my bill, well, I'll vote for your bill. Log rolling can help get a lot of things done by trading favors between politicians. Personal influences. This is also an important thing for why Congress does what it does. Politicians, by and large, they want to be reelected. So to get reelected, they'll do things like meet with constituents, meet with people that either voted for them or are, likely voters, possible voters. They also like to claim credit for things, even if they necessarily weren't a part of that development. But if, let's say, something good happens in a district, like a new company moves in, well, maybe they'll claim credit for attracting a company moving into their district, even if they didn't have any real influence on attracting that company. They'll often try to advance to higher political office. So if you're a state senator, maybe you'll try to become a governor, or maybe you'll try to become a U.S. senator. If you're a U.S. senator, well, maybe you'll try to run for president someday, or maybe governor of a state. So politicians often want to stay in office, and that'll shape their behavior. They often want to advance their political careers, and they do that they literally do it by trying to move up in the chain, and they try to accomplish that through claiming credit for projects and by meeting people, winning people over. So personal influences are also important. And then finally, outside influences. These groups are particularly important. So lobbyists, people that go to political offices and try to talk politicians into voting a certain way on a certain issue, that'll be important. Also, interest groups. Interest groups are groups that have a certain take, a certain interest in a given issue. Like, for instance, there's lots of environmental interest groups. And they'll try to convince Congress or congressmen, congresswomen, to vote in a given way on some kind of special interest legislation. These can also be really important for why Congress does what it does and why congressmen, congresswomen vote the way that they do. All right, so that's what we'll say about the Congress. So let's turn to the presidency. So we haven't talked about the presidency yet. So we just talked about Congress. This is the branch of government that's the closest to the people. It's the branch that the founders thought people would be most kind of attached to or aware of, because they thought we would all be much more interested in our representatives than in the president. It hasn't really worked that way over time. Couple first points about the presidency. First is just the president has multiple roles and responsibilities. The president does a lot of different things. So we have three main types of presidential powers. So we have expressed powers, implied powers, and delegated powers. So we'll walk through each one of these in more detail, but basically express powers are those that are in the Constitution, like the power to execute the laws. That's like the preeminent power that the president has, to execute the laws. It's the main job he does. He also has implied powers. These are a little bit more vague, but implied powers are powers that the president thinks he needs to execute the laws. We'll show some examples of what those are. But these are things that the president feels he has the authority to do by virtue of what is in the Constitution. It's implied. And then finally, there are delegated powers, those given to the president by Congress. All right, so let's walk through these. All right, so express powers. These are the most basic powers in the Constitution for the president. The first one is this executing the laws. Oops. Executing the laws. This is the first and foremost thing the president does. Other things the president can do, it can try to appoint. He has appointment powers, so he can try to appoint people to positions. He can veto legislation, grant pardons. We'll talk about pardons in a little bit. And serve as commander-in-chief. The president is in control of the military. That doesn't mean we can just go to war whenever the president wants, but the president is the civilian head of the military. We have a civilian-controlled military in this country. So those are all expressed powers. Then we have implied powers. Again, these are powers that the president thinks he has by virtue of the powers that are in the Constitution. So, for instance, executive orders, and this is going to be a big one. The president will issue orders that apply to the federal bureaucracy, and these orders explain how the bureaucracy is supposed to apply the laws. And there could be some gray areas in these laws. So the president can direct the bureaucracy to, act in a given way on a certain kind of issue. Like maybe it'll, like lately, President Trump tried to issue an executive order limiting migration, or refugees really, into this country from 7 Muslim majority countries. That was an executive order. Didn't stand, it got struck down twice in court, but that was nevertheless an executive order. It applied only to the federal bureaucracy. It didn't have the weight of law. Executive orders don't have the weight of law, but they still can be they can still carry a lot of impact on how the federal bureaucracy applies federal laws. Other implied powers, exercising executive privilege. This is the idea that the president can get advice from counselors without having to divulge what that advice is. Or the president can receive information, perhaps about national security, and he doesn't have to divulge that information if it might compromise national security. So those are all areas that the president feels he has implied powers. And then finally, delegated powers. These are powers given to the presidency from Congress. When the main delegated power is recommend department budgets. So the president doesn't write the budget, but he nevertheless can recommend a budget for different departments that he'll then send on to Congress. Federal bureaucracy. This is going to be important. We'll talk about this on Monday. The bureaucracy is the departments, agencies, and bureaus of the executive branch. So that's what we mean by the bureaucracy. We'll spend a couple days talking about it, so I'm not going to go into detail here. So let's see. We won't talk about. Well, we'll talk about. We won't talk about pardons and reprieves. So the power of the presidency has grown in recent years. Really, it's grown quite a bit since the beginning of this country. The president that we have, or the presidency that we have now, is very different from the kind of presidency that we had in the first administration. So we'll talk about how it's grown, how it's changed. So one basic measure of the growth in the presidency is the number of departments. We only had 3 departments in 1789, 3 departments in the federal bureaucracy: Department of War, Treasury, and State. Only 50 employees in the federal bureaucracy. Today we have 15 departments, 15 executive departments. Remember that number, 15, with 2.8 million employees. So that's a huge growth. You go from 50 people to 2.8 million people. How'd that happen? Well, we'll talk about that. It's happened for a number of reasons. One is the growth in policies and programs. The federal bureaucracy as a whole has shifted more to looking at economic issues in the 30s and 40s than looking into social and cultural issues in the 50s and 60s. So just the change in orientation for the federal bureaucracy. That's been a big source of growth in the presidency. Also the role of political parties in the media. When the country was founded, we didn't have political parties. But since then, we have developed a very robust and stable party system. The president can use political parties to get his agenda through Congress. Same with the media. We didn't have a mass media when the country was first founded. It only developed over time. But the president has been able to use the media to speak to constituents and thereby put pressure on Congress to do what the president wants. And then globalization. Globalization is the spread of technology, communication, and politics around the world. Globalization can create a lot of pressures as countries are trying to stay afloat, as countries are trying to not be overwhelmed by foreign money coming across their borders or foreign trade coming in, not demolishing their local industries. Globalization can be very problematic. And the president has been in a pretty good place to try to manage the challenges of globalization. So those are all reasons why the presidency has grown. Despite having grown, executive power is still pretty limited in some important ways. Some of those ways is Congress confirms presidential appointments and can override presidential vetoes. So it can override presidential vetoes. Remember that. It's an important check on the presidency. Same with confirming presidential appointments. The president can appoint whoever he wants, but it doesn't mean that Congress is going to confirm it. All right. The last point we'll make about the presidency in our short lecture, presidential personality and character matter. If we want to understand presidential performance, we can learn a lot about good presidents and bad presidents by looking at the types of people that they are. Scholars have studied this. So Richard Neustadt argued that presidential performance is in large part the result of the president's power to persuade. So Neustadt, he points to the power to persuade. Power to persuade. That's what he thinks makes for a successful president. Presidents that are not persuasive, if they can't communicate effectively, if they can't win people over, those are not going to be effective presidents. The most effective presidents are those that are persuasive. They can talk Congress and other important players. They can talk these people into supporting the president's agenda. Same with the public. If the president can sell his agenda to the public, that's a persuasive president, and therefore that's an effective president, according to Richard Neustadt. Another model comes from a scholar named James David Barber. So he argues that presidential character and performance are a product of character and worldview. So he measures character and worldview in two orientations. One is whether they're passive or active in their approach to the job. They can attack the duties of the office each day. They can be vigorous and excited to come into the office. Or they can be kind of, there out of duty. They might be stressed. They might have a passive outlook about the presidency. They're not really attacking the responsibilities of the office. They might have a positive or negative outlook. Some take more pleasure in the job than others. So these two orientations, he has four types based on these two orientations. The first is active, positive presidents. They enjoy the job. They love being president. These are typically the best presidents. They have high self-esteem. They value productivity. They seek personal and political goals. Their goal is to achieve results. And these probably are the best presidents. The most famous, perhaps, of these is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the stereotypical active, positive president. He loved it. He loved the give and take of politics. He loved the whole game. Active, positive president. Then we have the passive, positive presidents. They lack assertiveness. They're there. They're just kind of taking up space. They're performing out of duty. But, they want to be loved. They still enjoy the job. Most recent example of this, Ronald Reagan. Nice guy, not very active, enjoyed the job. Then we have active negative presidents. These are probably the worst kinds of presidents. They don't enjoy the job. They have low self-esteem, and they're often ambitious or power-seeking. These are not very good people, by and large. They probably are the worst presidents, by and large. One example of that, the most characteristic example for Barber is Richard Nixon. Very much an active negative president. And then finally, passive negative presidents. They serve out of a sense of duty. They don't like conflict. Low self-esteem. They want to be virtuous. They want to be good people, kind of above the fray. The typical example of this, Dwight Eisenhower. President 1952 to 1960. Wasn't a bad president, or 1953 to 1961. Wasn't a bad president. Didn't really want to be president. Didn't do a bad job, but just wasn't very vigorous. So, all right. So that's what we want to say about the president. It's a very whirlwind tour of the presidency, I admit. But that's what we have time for today. So I'll see you all on Monday with a discussion of the federal bureaucracy.